Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us as we are about to embark upon a new limud, a new teaching in our daily WhatsApp lessons. And this is called the Maimra Bitaken, which is the classical essay on Bitachon of the BEIS HALEVI, Rabbi Yosef Dov Soloveitchik. And as has been always our custom, we try to start with a biographical sketch of the author of the sefer that we are learning to give us some insight and idea as to where this person, this great scholar, this great sage is coming from, so we should understand and appreciate the words of his teachings and his writings even better. So without any further ado, we're speaking today about Rabbi Yosef Dov Soloveitchik. He was known as the BEIS HALEVI because of the famous work that he wrote on the Chumash. He was born in Russia in the year 1820 and he died in Russia in the year 1892, so he lived approximately 72 years. He was known already from his youth as a genius, as a magnificent mind. He hailed from a very prestigious family. His mother, Rivka, was the granddaughter of Rav Chaim Volozhiner, which means the following, that Rav Soloveitchik was the great-grandson of Rav Chaim Volozhiner, who was the main disciple of the Vilna Gaon, who was the father of the yeshiva movement in what we would call the modern era of Judaism, of Yiddishkeit. He was the first one to begin the yeshiva in Volozhin, and it was really the prototype for all of the yeshivas that we have throughout the world today. So we're talking about a man who hails from greatness. The yichus, the lineage, was something that was very impressive, and he certainly did not sit idly by on his laurels and just enjoy the fact that he came from such a noble and prestigious Torah family. Rather, he utilized his mind, he used his scholarship and his wisdom to become one of the greatest minds of his generation. There's a beautiful story which is told that he lived for some time in a city called Brod. And there was the great Rav Shlomo Kluger, was the Rav of Brod, and he was known as one of the great Gedolim, one of the great leaders of that generation. And he and the Brisker Rav learned together very often. The BEIS HALEVI, they learned together very often. And when it was time for the BEIS HALEVI, Rav Soloveitchik, to leave Brod, and he was moving on in his life, so Rav Kluger said to him, all these years that we're learning together, you always answered up my kushios, you answered up my difficult Talmudic questions. But I have one difficulty that I'm not sure how you're going to answer that. And he asked his young Talmud the following question: how will I manage to part from you? So great was the esteem that one of the greatest leaders of the generation of Shlomo Kluger had of Rav Soloveitchik, that he told him, you're going to leave me, how am I going to survive, how am I going to learn, how am I going to continue to grow in my learning without you being over here? Now, with the greatest mind that he had, he was chosen to be the Rosh Yeshiva of the Volozhiner Yeshiva, which of course was the yeshiva of his great-grandfather, Chaim Volozhiner, and he was a co-Rosh Yeshiva together with Rav Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, and they reigned over the yeshiva for 10 years together. At a certain point after 10 years, Rav Soloveitchik felt that it was better for him to move on to a new position on his own, and he ended up going on and becoming a Rav in 1865 in a city called Slutsk. And there, when he became the Rav in that city, he was a big pikech, he was a very wise individual who saw things going on around him, and he realized that the cheder, the school where the young boys were learning, he said he saw that many of the children were coming from poor families. They were impoverished, and the lunches that the food that the boys were eating was inappropriate for a young growing boy. So he made up with the people who lived in that community that they should arrange lunches for these boys. They should help to arrange the meals for the boys in order that they would be able to eat and they would be able to thrive and they would get the nourishment that they needed to continue to grow in their gashmi and their physical and their ruchni and their spiritual. And he set up an entire system over there so that every single child was taken care of in the right way. His son, Rav Chaim Soloveitchik, who was also renowned for his chesed, just like his father was, said over the following idea between him and his father. And he said, I myself, he said Rav Chaim Soloveitchik, I respond to the needs of the people around me. Someone comes to me, they tell me that they're poor, I'll give them money. They tell me that they're hungry, I'll give them food. He said, but my father, the great Rabbi Yosef Dov Soloveitchik, my father was different. He went and he discovered on his own what the needs of the people around him were. He didn't wait till the poor man came. He went to the poor man. Till the hungry man came, he went to the hungry man. To the person who needed the shidduch, he helped out with the shidduch, whatever it was. That was although he was in the greatness of scholarship and brilliance, he was in another realm of existence, but he was right down here in this world as well, and he was able to see the needs of the people that were around him. Eventually, in that city of Slutsk, the Haskalah, the enlightenment became very strong, and it was permeating the streets and the walls of the Bate Midrashim that were there, and the BEIS HALEVI felt that it was time to move on. He left Slutsk, he went to a small town in Warsaw, he went to Warsaw, and over there he lived in abject poverty, but he didn't care because he could not be civil, he could not handle the fact that the Haskalah of the Enlightenment had become so strong in that town of Slutsk, and he ran away from it. Until finally, in 1877, there was a town called Brisk, and the Rav of that town was Rabbi Yeshua Leib Diskin, and in 1877 he made Aliyah, he went to Eretz Yisrael. They called upon the BEIS HALEVI to become the Rav of that town, and he served there from 1877 until 1892, when he passed away, and his son Rav Chaim ended up taking over. And this Rav Soloveitchik ended up becoming the scion for the Soloveitchik family. They became what we know as, what we call in the yeshiva world, the Brisker dynasty. It came from him and then to his son Rav Chaim, and then from Rav Chaim to his son, and so on and so forth. And today, one of the greatest, most prominent yeshiva systems in all of the world, certainly in Eretz Yisrael, Yerushalayim, and the like, is called the Brisker Yeshiva, and it's all based upon the foundations of the learning and the tutelage of the great Rav Yosef Dov Soloveitchik, who we call the BEIS HALEVI, based on his masterpiece work on the Chumash itself. Now that is the small background of the BEIS HALEVI, and let's just give you a little introduction into this sefer that we're about to learn, called the Maimra Bitaken, which is his classical essay on Bitachon, which is dealing with trust and reliance and faith in HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And it's very interesting to note that this sefer was written approximately, written about in the year, somewhere around the year he passed away in 1892, so it was written while he was still alive, and it was not published until almost 100 years after he passed away in the year 1985. So what's the reason that this sefer somehow did not get published for over 100 years after it was written? And the reasons are somewhat unknown. However, it is known that it was passed over to his youngest son, Rav Simcha, who was born in Warsaw in 1879, so that's only 3 years before his father passed away. He learned with his father, and then he learned with his brother Reb Chaim, who took over for his father after he had passed away. And by the age of 20 years old, Simcha himself was a giant in Torah. In 1911, he was appointed a position as a Rav in a town called Moyilov, which itself was the town that the Malbim, the great Malbim, one of the greatest commentators on Tanakh, had been the Rav previously. And he made a yeshiva, and he had many, many people that came and learned there. And Rav Simcha himself, in 1924, he ended up coming to America. And when he left Europe, he took his father's manuscripts and transcripts with him. And this unpublished manuscript, this Maimra Bitaken, this sefer that he writes on Bitachon, on how to trust in HaKadosh Baruch Hu, he brought it with him to America. And still unpublished. In 1942, before he passed away, he gave over these manuscripts to his only son, who was named Rabbi Yosef Dov Soloveitchik, after his grandfather over here, the BEIS HALEVI. And then this man, Rabbi Yosef Dov Soloveitchik, he himself held on to the manuscripts, and later on, finally, stored away in Monsey, New York, where he was living in America. Finally, in 1985, it was printed for the first time. Now, what is the reason that it took over 100 years for this Maimra Bitaken to be printed? So it could be, as Rav Yaakov Hillel, who was one of the preeminent Rosh Yeshivas of our time, one of the biggest Kabbalists of our time as well, when he wrote an approbation for this Sefer, he said that we're living in times where Amunah, where our faith in HaKadosh Baruch Hu and His Torah and the way that Hashem runs the world is challenged at every single corner. And we are a nation that is struggling to have pure, true, solid belief in HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And therefore it's not a coincidence, it's all part of the plan of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that this Maimra Bitaken, this book that was written over 100 years ago on how to trust and believe in HaKadosh Baruch Hu, appears in our generation. It appears in a generation that needs the clarity, that needs the chizuk, the inspiration, that needs to understand how we practically can work on believing and trusting in Hashem and inculcating that not into our lexicon of the hashkafa, the way that we look at the world, the way that we look at Yiddishkeit, but in our very daily activities that we do, so that we can live a life that is infused with amunah and infused and elevated with bitachon. So our hope and our prayer be'ez Hashem is, as we embark upon the Maimra Bitaken, tomorrow we'll begin the actual text itself. We'll take the words of this tremendous scholar, the BEIS HALEVI, Rabbi Yosef Dov Soloveitchik, words that were penned over 100 years ago, and he himself lived in a very difficult time and went through many challenges in his life as well, that is well known. And yet still his bitachon never wavered, his amunah only got stronger. And we are the beneficiaries to read the words that he wrote so long ago to infuse our generation and ourselves, our relationships, our families, our communities, Klal Yisrael, with pure, unadulterated bitachon, trust and reliance in HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which will help us to grow each and every day in our understanding, our appreciation, and our relationship with the Bari Olam, the creator of the world, who is the source from which all of our strength and amunah and our bitachon comes from. Have a wonderful day. Look forward, be'ez Hashem, to continuing and starting our learning of the Sefer Maimra Bitaken tomorrow morning, be'ez Hashem. All the best.